Welcome to United Church of Canada History, which is course number CH2105 for the fall of 2021. My name's Ross Bartlett. For those of you who I haven't met, it's a pleasure to be working with you this term, working with all of you on this important subject. As we begin our time together, there are some important questions that I'd invite us to ask and to answer. The first question is, why are you taking this course? Or perhaps more honestly, because some of you may be here only because of its requirement for you, the question might be, what do you hope you will gain from this course? I really do want you to think about that because as adult learners, your motivation is very important. Another question. What comes to mind when you think of the study of history? One of the most fortunate experiences in my educational life was when, as a young person, a young student in elementary school, I encountered teachers who moved history away from the memorization of names and dates to the real lives of real people. For too many people, their memories of grade school and high school history is caught up with the memorization of apparently disconnected facts. That's really not very good history. When we move beyond names and dates, we discover some important things. It's significant to remember that all history comes from a point of view. Once we move beyond the bare bones of this event happened on such and such a day and these people were present, we are moving into a point of view. Technically, that's referred to as ideology, which simply means a manner of thinking or the ideas at the basis of some system or means of analysis. And this can be particularly true when we're talking about religious and church history. Let me give you a couple of examples. Many years ago, I was in the Soviet Union, and a tour guide referred to the Great English Bourgeois Revolution. Well, I had never heard of that, and I doubt you had too. But what she had in mind was what you and I may have learned to call the English Civil War. Speaking of civil wars, while I was doing work at Princeton Seminary, I heard a phrase I'd never encountered before. You and I would probably call it the American Civil War. Classmates from the southern states referred to it as the War of Northern Aggression. So you see that even in something as simple as what we might name a thing, some viewpoint or ideology kicks in. Even this course and its title has some ideology to it. The name United Church History assumes that there is such a thing as the United Church of Canada, that we can somehow identify items in its story, that we can name such events as church history and identify them distinctly from events in the wider society. And it further assumes the existence of a field of study called history with texts and methods for an endeavor. Now, I realize that some of those are pretty easy to identify, but may not really excite you. But I hope it demonstrates that some clarity about language is important. Words matter. How we choose to describe something is important. And for those of you who are preachers or who are going on to be preachers, this is a really significant lesson. Words matter. How we name something, how it gets named, is crucially important. In a very real way, names and words are constituent of reality. So, why study history? Well, the first answer is a purely utilitarian one. You and I did not drop into this particular place in time all on our own. The church we have today, and even our own lives, are the products of different forces. Most of us are parts of communities of faith that have a history. That history, for good or ill, continues to influence us today. If we do the work to better understand those factors, we can be more effective. Now, there are different forms of history, just as there are different forms of biblical interpretation or different schools of pastoral care or of systematic theology. Different forms of history will focus in different areas and provide different results. Some of the historical schools are economic history, which focuses on economic concerns, employment, spending, and so on. Social history studies the organizations that people create as a door to insight. Military history focuses on conflict as the great driver of the human story. The history of ideas focuses on writings and ideas as the prime shapers and movers of human history. And those are just a few of the historical schools. In this course, you and I will primarily engage in social and intellectual history. In other words, we will be focusing on groups, organizations, and movements of people, and the writings and speaking of key individuals and groups. Now, our social location or context makes a difference in the work that we do. So you and I are engaged in this study of history through a theological school, which adds another layer on top. The fact that most of you are preparing or are already giving leadership in Christian communities of faith adds another dimension. I want to warn us about something. That in religious circles there is a practice that sometimes masquerades as history, but is not. It's actually a distorted form of propaganda. It's not history. It involves developing an idea or establishing a position and then ransacking the storehouse of the past to find the examples that support our ideas. That's not the way we're going to do history. We will have reason to focus in detail on the residential schools later in our time together. But for now, allow me to use that chapter in our United Church history as an example of how historians truly go about their work. There would seem to be little ground to dispute the fact that Indian residential schools existed, that the churches participated in the running of them, and that some of those churches included the Methodist and Presbyterian forebears of the United Church of Canada, as well as the United Church itself. So consider the residential schools as a subject for historical research and writing. What could we focus on? What might we say? Well, firstly, we can pretty clearly establish that the schools existed in different provinces between certain dates. That the United Church and its forebears had specific administrative responsibilities for certain schools. That both government and churches made statements regarding the purpose of the schools. We can establish with a fair degree of certainty how many children were enrolled in the schools, and we also know with a similar clarity how many children did not return home. We can establish the reality of actions which have come to be labeled sexual, psychological, and physical abuse, as well as linguistic and cultural suppression, which some label as forms of genocide. We might label those the facts of the event. Those are the historical facts with which you as a historian will work. They are, for the most part, not in dispute. But when we move beyond reporting those facts, we're moving into interpretation. So, as a historian working from those facts, you might want to develop one or more of the following. You might look at the background of the government's motivation for establishing the schools, recognizing that it is possible to uncover a mix of motives in the existing documentation. You might want to look at the background to the church's motivation for agreeing to administer the schools. You certainly might be able to make observations about the mixture of British imperialism and Christian triumphalism. You could look at curriculum content and teaching methods, results of residential school involvement. We call that interpretation. And interpretation is an absolutely legitimate historical endeavor. Most historians go about their work because in some way we ought to understand why something occurred. Most historians want to figure out how item A relates to result B. With that in mind, the difference between facts and interpretation, let's ponder the matter of motivation. What can you, as a legitimate historian, do? Well, you can talk about the participants and what they believed to be true, whether or not you accept it. What they believe to be true is not based on whether or not you agree with its truth. You can also talk about your own beliefs about what happened, regardless of whether or not the participants named that as a factor. What you are not free to do as a genuine historian is to say something happened which did not happen. That's dishonest. To avoid an obvious explanation for an event. That's foolish. You are not free to deny what people claim as their own experience, even though you are free to disagree with their interpretation of that experience. You are not free to say that God did something as a fact statement rather than a belief statement. That takes the matter out of the realm of historic discourse and turns it into apologetics. Does that mean you absolutely have to deny or closet your faith to engage in history? Definitely not. For instance, St. Augustine believed that Christian history is neither a deterministic system nor a meaningless chaos. You can share that belief. If you are so motivated, you can see the events of history as evidence of the judgment, mercy, moral meaning, and spiritual significance. You are also constrained as a limited human being to recognize that no judgment, mercy, meaning, or significance is utterly ambiguous. But you do have to own the conclusions that you arrive at, rather than offering them as absolutes. Martin Luther wrote about the hiddenness of God in history. There is mystery as well as purpose in the unfolding historical drama, and the challenge is always to maintain a balance between overassurance and overdifidence. At the risk of some sweeping generalization, what are some of the marks of the historian who is also a Christian believer? Well, in the first place, they are wary of universals. For instance, when someone says everyone knows or experience tells us, what we've learned is that such statements usually reveal only the experience of our particular group, generally the dominant group in society. Beware making universal, sweeping statements. Secondly, such historians are aware of their own assumptions. Alarm bells should go off in our heads when something historical seems obvious to us. Are we reading or writing something from our own time into the lives of people in the past? Yes, there is often a great deal of correspondence in the way people respond to events over the centuries, but we have to be careful in assuming that correspondence. Such historians recognize that judgment is unavoidable. The facts we choose to include or leave out, the way we set them down, and so on, they all involve judgment on our part. We will be engaging in judgment. So on what basis are your judgments being made? Such historians are realistic and open-minded. Human nature as we encounter it in history can be pretty shocking. It is often hard as a historian to sustain a notion of the universal goodness and perfectibility of humankind. On the other hand, it's inappropriate to give in to pure cynicism and say that people only do certain things for personal profit. There are times when people act better than we expect of them. And there are also times when the results turn out better than the sordid beginnings lead us to hope. So let's return for a moment to our opening questions. I asked you what comes to mind when you think about the study of history. But now I want to change that slightly and ask, why do you think that church history is a required part of your course of study and of the traditional theological school or seminary program? Why bother with history? Well, most of my life I've been both a working parish pastor and a professional historian, somebody who reads and teaches and writes history. And let me try and tell you what the study of history means to me. By studying history, we enter into a conversation with those who have gone before us, carrying the Christian tradition. We are trying to hear the voices left behind as clearly as possible. And so the first goal of studying history is to try and comprehend what their situation meant to the people who were actually involved in it. And that's sometimes harder than it may sound, because it means setting aside some of our assumptions to understand their position. We remember that we are all historical actors. We are all making history, and our motives and our actions are hardly ever focused singly. Take us, for example. Suppose someone were to be writing the history of the class of CH2105 in the fall term of 2021. They could write that the members of the class had these names. They might note that instead of being in person, the class was conducted virtually. They could record that they met online from 12 weeks from September to December. The instructor was Ross Bartlett. So far, that's pretty boring history. It's when you start to push past the stories, past those things, that the story starts to get interesting. So who were these people really, and what motivated them to participate? Was there a relationship between them, and what was it? What about the instructor, beyond the rather boring titles of his presentations? What did he say? What did he do? What happened in those sessions? What insights or aha moments did any of the participants receive? That's when history starts to come alive, as we seek to understand the whole story of the people that went before us. And so, what about us? The study of history in our context is also an attempt to understand ourselves. How did we get here? The people and situations we study had a role in shaping who we are today. We didn't spring into being out of nothing. Our traditions, convictions, concerns, attitudes, beliefs, and practices, basically everything that we call church today, is shaped in part by those who went before. And so we take that material, that deposit of the tradition, and we shape it again and pass it on to the next generation. And so in studying history, we are attempting to arrive at a clear understanding of what's been passed on to us. In studying history, we bring our own concerns into the story. That's why there's some freedom in this course to explore the things in the United Church's story that really interest you. We might say, I'm interested in why we sit in rows. I'm interested in why we use little glasses at communion. I'm interested in why the church feels it needs to make statements on social issues. I'm interested in the changes in church music, and many others. And so you can go off and follow what interests you and come back and report on what you discover. That's the way you are acting as real historians, tracing down the roots of an issue that is alive and real for you today in the church. It's important to remember that history is not the memorization of names and dates. Dates are crucial markers. It's the way we find our path on the highways of time. When the First World War began, or who was the moderator or prime minister at different times, can serve as guideposts along the journey. This isn't purely academic. We come from an ideological position. We're interested in history. The people to whom you preach and teach are genuinely interested in their own story, because to some extent it helps them understand who they are and learn about themselves. So what will we be doing this term? You might want to take a break for a moment, and when you come back, have the course outline, the syllabus handy as we walk through it. So let's look together at the trajectory of our time together this term. I'm pleased to welcome our teaching assistant for this term, the Reverend Kate Jones. Kate is a graduate of the Atlantic School of Theology who is in ministry with the good folk of the Two Rivers Pastoral Charge in New Brunswick. The first pages of the outline syllabus tell you why we're doing what we're doing and the objectives. The general matters follow. And there's an item there about contacting me. The best way is to send an email to my AST address. I would not advise you to send emails from within Brightspace itself. I haven't had good experience in getting those emails. So you can call me as well, please, particularly if you're outside of Atlantic Canada. Check the time zone before you call me. That just is a request. You can make appointments to see me individually by going to my calendar online with the information that's there. And I'm also going to be holding virtual office hours most Tuesday mornings from 9:30 to 11 Halifax time if you want to drop in and chat about anything. And the link for that, the constant link for that during the term is also in your syllabus. I do attempt a quick turnaround on assignments. I think it's important that you know the results of your work as quickly as possible so that you can begin to incorporate it. Of course, the turnaround time depends on how many are submitted at any given moment. But I will acknowledge the receipt of something within 24 hours. And if you don't get a response from me, please inquire or send it again, because it is known for things to get lost. There are about 21 people enrolled in the course as of this time. There may be more by the time we get started. Then we talk about participation, and participation, because this is graduate work, participation is very important, not only for your learning, but for your peers as well. So participation will form part of your mark for the term. Standards of written work, the questions of inclusive or expansive language, and so on are also discussed there. Please submit all assignments as email attachments. Please use a standard word processing program, not PDF formats, however, because I like to be able to put comments within your text. Assignments are due on the dates that are noted on the syllabus by 7 o'clock p.m. your local time, which will be noted on the date timestamp of the accompanying email. There are 2 required texts, and many of the readings will also be available through Brightspace. Recommend that you complete the readings prior to watching the week's online lecture. Each week on Thursday evening, there'll be a lecture like this one available for you to watch. We'll be dividing the class up into discussion groups of about 5 people, and you are responsible for posting a reflection as discussed there in the course outline, and responding to the reflections of one or more of your small group classmates. That's all outlined there on the in the syllabus. Okay? So you will have readings each week, you will have reflections to do, and there's a rubric there for the marking of the participation. There are 2 essays this term. The first is due in October and the second at the end of November. For Essay 1, I'm offering you the following options. You can provide a standard sort of academic essay. You can make a presentation on video. Or you can prepare an education plan to indicate how you're going to take the material that you're learning and take it into your congregation. In each case, there are the rubrics for doing that in the syllabus. The second essay is a formal essay which will be submitted, which will be footnoted and have bibliography, and all of the rules of academic writing will apply. The dates that are found in the syllabus are those that correspond to when the lecture will be available. We will be using the gradebook system on Brightspace to keep you informed of how you are doing with each week's participation, and adding in subsequent marks as essays are recorded. Let me say a little bit more about the participation mark. Participation and interaction with your peers is a significant portion of this course. At the same time, I recognize that we do not always control the flow of events in our lives, and sometimes things get beyond our capacity to be in charge of. So the participation is structured in such a way that upon notice to me, you can skip a week without penalty. You can have a free week if you like. The final mark will be counted out of 10 weeks participation. If you participate in all 11 weeks, what that means is that your lowest mark will drop off. Hopefully, providing that little bit of flexibility will assist you in this course. The outline for the course is there from week to week to week, and the readings are there. Sometimes I provide you with a focus question. I recognize that there is a significant amount of reading for this course. This is the only exposure you will have to the history of the United Church, and so there's much to go through. Hopefully the readings will not be overwhelming for you. And I look forward to seeing you next week as we begin to talk about the founding genius of the United Church of Canada. Thanks very much.